All right, young true believers. So, chapter 6, we're talking about relevance fallacies, or they're also known as red herring fallacies, and they're so called because prisoners who would escape from corrections institutions would go fishing for herring because herring is a fish with a particularly powerful odor, and they would drag it across their trail. And the reason they would do this is it would throw the hound dogs, off the trail because uh, it had such a again intense smell that the dogs would follow that scent instead of scent to the prisoners. So these are again called relevance fallacies, and the reason they're called relevance fallacies is because the premise in this case, right, in these cases, I should say, are not relevant to the issue in question, right? Which leads us to the most common logical fallacy on planet Earth, and that's the ad hominem argument. Ad hominem Latin, to the man, right, to the person, all right? So here is an example of that. Not only have I seen you text and drive, but last week you were saying it isn't dangerous to do that, right? So pointing out somebody's hypocrisy is irrelevant, obviously, to whether or not you should be doing it yourself. If your doctor smokes 2 packs a day and tells you you shouldn't smoke, then you shouldn't point out the hypocrisy of her position. Just know that you shouldn't smoke, right? Now, there are two variations on the ad hominem. There is the circumstantial ad hominem. And circumstantial ad hominem occurs when we attack someone's circumstances, right, instead of addressing their arguments. So, if your priest tells you that they're against in vitro fertilization or abortion, right, you can't dismiss what they say out of hand by saying, well, they're a priest and priests are required to hold such a view. That's a circumstantial ad hominem. Uh, and then there's what's known as the consistency ad hominem, which is when you attack someone for having changed their mind, which is ridiculous. I mean, here's an example of that. In '08, when he was running for president, then Senator Obama said he was against gay marriages, but in '12, when he was running for re-election, he said his views on that particular issue had quote evolved, and now he was in favor of gay marriage. So people attacked him for again changing his mind, right? So that's an inconsistency ad hominem. Poisoning the well, all right. Now, poisoning the well differs from a regular ad hominem because in poisoning the well, what we try to do is get someone to dismiss the argument before they've even had a chance, uh, before you've even had a chance to read it or listen to it or even hear about it, right? Um, it's in this case the person who's being dismissive doesn't want you to hear the argument, right? They'll give you a caricatured version of it and tell you that it's safe to ignore it. Guilt by association, very common fallacy, right? Um, this one is a variety of ad hominem that gets us to try to associate the view in question with someone or something or some group that we don't like, right? So here's the example from the text. You think transgender individuals have been denied equal rights? That sounds like something left-wing college professors would say. In this instance, they don't. They're assuming you don't want to be lumped in with we lefty college professors, right? The genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy occurs when we dismiss a claim owing to its origins. So a great example from the text: God is just an idea people came up with long before they had science, right? Even though the origins of a belief might be, you know, very ancient, that's no reason to assume that the view is mistaken, right? Straw man, I warned you guys against committing this fallacy when you were writing your essays. The straw man fallacy occurs when you distort, misrepresent, or otherwise alter your opponent's argument, right? It's an extremely common fallacy. Here's an example from the text. You say, I think we should legalize recreational marijuana. Your friend says, maybe you think everyone should walk around stoned, but I think that's absurd. That's clearly not what you were arguing. So again, with the straw man, you simply misrepresent. People do this because it's easier to dismiss, right, or to argue against a misrepresentation than it is to argue against a legitimately strong argument. The false dilemma, or ignoring other alternatives fallacy. So the false dilemma fallacy occurs when someone tries to establish a conclusion by offering it as the only alternative to something that we find unacceptable, unattainable, or implausible, right? So here's the example from the text. We must either eliminate Social Security or the country will go bankrupt, therefore we must eliminate Social Security. What is fallacious about this particular argument is that we have other options, right? And they are not listed, right? The pop philosopher, if you will, Ayn Rand, she's an ethical egoist, and she commits this fallacy in her writings. She tells people that there are only two alternatives when it comes to ethics. You can be entirely selfish and look out for number one, or you can sacrifice yourself for the good of others. And she thinks most people will opt for the former, but obviously most people, the vast majority of people, try to strike a balance between self-interest and the good of others, right? So that's the false dilemma. The perfectionist fallacy. This fallacy occurs when we ignore options between perfection and nothing, right? So this is the fallacy that you commit whenever you say taking a single English course isn't going to make me a great writer, so I don't see why I have to take one, right? Or taking an algebra class isn't going to make me an expert at math, so I don't see why I have to take one, right? There are alternatives between perfection and nothing. Line drawing fallacy. This fallacy occurs when we assume that either a clear-cut demarcation, a clear line, can be drawn between two concepts, or otherwise there's no difference between them, right? There's a great example of this in the text. It comes from the Supreme Court case concerning California's Prop 8. For those of you who are a bit young, Prop 8 was passed. I want to say this was 08 or 09. I think it was 08. And what it did is it outlawed gay marriage in California. So the state attorney general sued. This went all the way to the Supreme Court. And here's an example of line drawing fallacy from the testimony in the Supreme Court. So then Justice Antonin Scalia is asking questions of Theodore B. Olson, who's an attorney for California. Scalia asks, when did it, that is to say, gay marriage, become constitutional? And Olson replies, when we as a culture determine that sexual orientation is a characteristic that individuals cannot control. And Scalia says, I see, when did that happen? And Olson said, there is no specific date and time. And Scalia says, how am I supposed to know how to decide the case then? Well, I mean, that's ridiculous because social changes don't occur like that. They occur gradually over time. Now, this next one is very involved. These are two closely related fallacies. If you go to your doctor and you've been feeling sick and your doctor says, I think you got coronavirus, and you ask, okay, well, what makes you think that? And the doctor says, what makes you think you don't? It's time to get a new doctor, right? What the doctor just did is shift the burden of proof onto you. The doctor, being the expert, is supposed to be the one with the proof, right? So this is a fallacy known as misplacing the burden of proof, right? Now, burden of proof needs a bit of explanation. Burden of proof falls on the person who is making the claim that something is the case. If I make the claim that Bigfoot exists or God exists, then I better produce the evidence that Bigfoot, some kind of footprint cast, photographs, a carcass of Bigfoot, whatever. If I'm claiming that God exists, I better have a very, very good argument. And incidentally, gang, none of the arguments for God can establish the existence of God. Conversely, none of the arguments against God can completely rule out the possibility of God. Philosophers of religion, they debate the probabilities, just FYI. So anyway, this fallacy is called misplacing the burden of proof, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You try to shift your, what philosophers call ontological responsibility, that is your responsibility to prove that something is the case, that it exists, onto someone who does not have that responsibility, right? So a good example from the text, I believe President Obama's birth certificate was a forgery. Can you prove it isn't? The person in question is making the claim that Obama's birth certificate was a hoax, it was a forgery. It's their responsibility, their epistemic and ontological responsibility to prove that the president's birth certificate was a hoax. Closely related to this is the appeal to ignorance fallacy. And here's a classic example of appeal to ignorance. Nobody has proved ghosts don't exist, so therefore ghosts totally exist. So appeal to ignorance occurs when people forget that proof requires more than an absence of disproof, right? So I'll be back on Wednesday with the second half of these fallacies.